Okay, in this lesson, we're going to be learning more about the y-intercept equation. In previous lessons, we learned how to graph a y equals, for example, negative 1/2 x plus 1 by going through and substituting in for x. So in the past, when we've done this, we have picked our x's and solved for y. So we might pick, because this is a fraction, 0, 2, and 4. So we picked our multiples of 2 because we were working with a fraction. We then had to go through and substitute in for every single one of these to be able to find what our y is. Okay, so if I did negative half of 0, well, half of 0 is 0, plus 1 would give me 1. Negative half of 2, well, half of 2 would be 1, so it would be a negative 1 plus 1 would give me 0. And negative half of 4 would give me negative 2 plus 1 would give me negative 1. We would then go through and actually have to plot all three of these coordinates. Today, what you guys are going to be learning is that you can now go through and learn how to solve and graph an equation without having to go through and substitute in. So we're going to learn a little bit about our y-intercept equation. So this is also known as the slope equation. How can you describe the graph of an equation using y equals mx plus b? Well, in our equation, you'll notice there's 4 different letters. We have y, we have x, which we've worked with, and we also now have an m and a b. Our m is also known as our slope of our line. So wherever we have an m, that is going to be identifying the slope of our line. So our slope is always connected to that x. Our b is going to be where it crosses our y line or where it intersects with the y-axis. Sometimes this does have a plus sign and sometimes it is a negative sign. So we'll work a little bit with both of them. But the equation is always written out as y equals mx plus b. It's just that sometimes instead of having a plus, it would be like plus a negative. And instead of writing a plus a negative, they just ignore the plus sign and write a minus. When we get to one of those, we'll explain that again. So today what we're going to be working with is just understanding those different pieces. Okay, so if I were to go through and graph our equation, y equals negative 1/2 x plus 1, my slope of my graph is the one that's connected to the x. So this is my slope. So my slope is negative 1/2. My point of intersection with the y-axis, which is where it crosses the y line, is my b in my equation. That was a positive 1. Okay, so now to go through and graph this, we're going to start with where it crosses the y line. So we always start there. So it crosses at the y line. Here's our y line at positive 1. We're going to put a dot. Now we're going to follow our slope, which was negative 1/2. So we're going to go down 1 and to the right 2. Okay, so from my point where it crossed the y line, I'm going to go down 1 and over to the right 2. I should now be able to go through and draw my line through that. Okay, so I extend my line through my graph, putting my arrows on each end. Okay, unless they give us a story problem, we're going to extend in both directions. So you'll notice if I were to just go back and check based on all of the work that I had to do back here, if I were to check each of these points, so I'm going to check each of these and see that they fall on the line. And they should, unless my line's not perfectly lined up in the corner. It might be slightly off. We'll shift this just a little bit. Sometimes this is a lot easier to do with a regular ruler. But if I were to go through and check each of these, so I'm going to mark them in red. They should fall on that line. Over to 0, up to 1. Well, there it is. It's one of my points. Over to 2, down to 0. So, or stay at 0. Over to 2, stay at 0. One of my points. Over to 4, down to negative 1. So over to 4, down to negative 1 is right there. So you'll notice all of the work that we used to have to do, we can now simplify. So as long as we can identify what the slope is and what the y-intercept is, and we can graph a given slope, you're going to be able to graph a line without having to use this concept. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and try another one. course, when we first start to learn slope, there's a reason that they have us do substitution so that we understand why we're going through all of the work. Okay, so here's letter C. Actually, I am going to keep this part out because it has my titles. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and look at this new equation. We have y equals negative x minus 1. So we're going to identify our slope and our graph. So when I look at this equation right here, because there's just a negative x there, I like to remember that it's actually y equals negative 1, because wherever there's just a letter, remember it also includes a 1, they just don't show it. X minus 2. So when I look through this, my slope of my graph, well, that's where I would have m. That's the one that's connected to the x. So my slope is right here, which would be negative 1. My point of where it crosses the y-intercept or crosses the y-line, which this is my y-line, is my b. So this is my b, which was negative 2. So take note, on this equation, we had a plus sign in our original, y equals mx plus b, but here, it's a minus sign. Okay, so it's not always going to be a plus sign, sometimes it's a negative sign, but that's just going through and telling us where it's crossing our y-intercept. So we're going to start at this point. We are going to do our point where it crosses the y-line at negative 2. So here's my y-line. I'm going to find negative 2 and put my dot. Okay, so that part's done. I'm now going to go through and follow my slope. So right now my slope is negative 1, but we guys do rise over run. So we have to remember when we're going through and working with a whole number in our slope area, or in our slope part of the equation, that we're going to write whatever the slope was, which was negative 1, and we're always going to write it no matter what the number is over 1. So now this is my slope that I'll count out. I'm going to go down 1 and to the right 1. Now I'll go ahead and draw my line. Now I am one also that continues my slope, especially when they start asking questions that deal with x and y intercept. I'll continue the pattern for a couple different ones just so that I know my line gets nice and perfect. And if I'm having to identify an x intercept, I'll continue until I cross my x line. Okay, so like here, although I went down and to the right, I could continue the pattern up and to the left also, up and to the left. And you can see that that's going to still create a straight line. Oops. Pull my line out, extend it out a little bit further, and put my arrow on each end. So now you can see that it's crossing through. If they were to ask, which they will in the future, what my x-intercept was, well, where does it cross our x line? That would be at negative 2. And that will come up later in this lesson, is learning that you also have an x-intercept. Okay, so let's go ahead and try another one of these. Identifying and graphing. So when you guys are graphing, you can just be using your whiteboard so that you can practice that concept. It'll make things a little bit easier as you get into the lesson if you've already practiced it. Okay, so here's my next equation, y equals 3x plus 2. Once again, my slope is my m. That's this part of my equation. And my y-intercept is my b part of the equation. Okay, so here's my m, which is connected to the x, which was a 3. And my b was a positive 2, so positive 2. You want to make sure that you identify that positive or negative because that will affect your line if you don't put it on the correct number. Okay, so now when we graph this, we always start at our y-axis point, which was positive 2. So here's our y line. We're going to go to positive 2 and put a dot. And now we're going to follow our slope. So our slope is a positive 3. Remember, if it's a whole number, we always write it over 1. So I'm going to go up 3 and to the right 1. So from my point, my blue point there, I'm going to go up 3, 1, 2, 3, and to the right 1. Now, if I wanted to continue that pattern, I could up 3, 1, 2, 3 to the right 1. I could also go backwards so that I can work to see in case I'm having to find where it crosses the X line, which this one doesn't work perfect, but we'll still continue it. So instead of going up, I'm going to go down and to the left. It just has me practice that reverse. So if I go down 3, 1, 2, 3, and over 1, down 3, 1, 2, 3, over 1, notice the pattern stays the same all the way throughout. Okay, so now I can go ahead and put my line through these. Oops. Accidentally grabbed the graph instead of the line. Okay, you'll notice I got slightly off when I went through to shift that. So there we go. I got that lined up a little bit better. Draw my arrows at each end, and that is what y equals 3x plus 2 would look like for a slope. Once again, this is going to start to save you time, so you don't have to go through and substitute in. It's also going to alleviate some of those parts where maybe you were not very good at substituting in and solving. So now the two key things is you have to be able to identify your y-intercept and your slope of your line. You'll always start with your y-intercept and then follow your slope from that point. Good luck with this part of the lesson.